morning. Morning again. See a few regular faces here in the audience. Nice that everybody comes to these Saturday morning speaker series sponsored by University College, named after the Master of Liberal Arts program. As you know, we run this every Saturday during the month of February, this time, in this place. So I hope you'll join us again next week for a talk on rhythm and natural language, and the week after that for a talk on circadian rhythms. So you'll set your biological clock to make sure you get up in time to be here. But I'm delighted that you're out on such a cold morning. The hot toddies will be in the lobby after the speech. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Mark Rollins, the Dean of University College, and I'm delighted to be able to talk to you a bit about the series and about our speaker today. We're fortunate to have as our speaker today Colin Burnett, who is Assistant Professor in Film and Media Studies here at Washington University. Professor Burnett received his PhD in film from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is, of course, a leading department in the field in 2011. And since then, he's been very busy. In 2017, he published a book called The Invention of Robert Bresson, The Auteur and His Market. He's also published a significant number of articles and chapters focusing on the ideas, sensibilities, and social relationships that making of media and film. He's currently at work on a second book called Serial Bonds. That's serial with an S, not a C. The complete title is Serial Bonds, The Multimedia Life of 007. The book deals with how the James Bond franchise, and I'm quoting now from Colin's own description, has resulted in one of the most complex experiments in serial storytelling in the history of the media franchise. I should say, with that book in mind, I'm tempted to introduce Colin in the manner of Agent 007, Burnett, Colin Burnett. But the Bond franchise is not the topic of this talk today. Rather, Colin will talk about interests that a number of us in various departments here at Washington University share, and that is knowing how various aspects of the pictorial arts, in this case film, are perceived and understood. His talk today is titled Rhythm à la française, How French Filmmakers Reinvented Musical Perception. Please welcome Colin Burnett.
Well, thank you so much for coming. Can everyone hear me properly? Okay, great. There are good acoustics here, and I think that's appropriate for rhythm, I guess. Thank you so much to Dean Rollins for the introduction and for inviting me to participate in this series of talks. Some people sometimes say, how do you move from French cinema to James Bond? And I simply point out the fact that the filmmaker who you're going to be introduced today to, Robert Bresson, he's one of the key figures who reinvented musical perception. He loved James Bond movies, and in fact called them, very importantly, movies that played with rhythm in interesting ways. All right, so there is some sort of connection between the two. All right, just a moment. Let me begin with a question. Must we view rhythm strictly as a musical concept, as a term that refers only to the perception of music? Well, as you're going to learn today, French critics, theorists, filmmakers, and others have been working on this question, digging into it, exploring it for quite some time. To situate ourselves then, at the very beginning, let's consider a filmmaker. Throughout much of the late silent era of cinema, roughly the mid-1920s, and into the early 1930s, French directors with roots in the avant-garde, like René Clair, revered for much of the 20th century as one of cinema's great auteurs in France, set out to prove that cinema, even narrative cinema, fictional cinema, could approximate music. This was an era when filmmakers and theorists wished to establish the legitimacy of cinema as an art form, and they did so by drawing analogies between cinematic techniques and those of the more established arts. In a 1925 essay simply entitled Rhythm, Claire does just that. He cites a well-known authority on rhythm, the British classicist E.A. Sonnenschein. This is René Clair. Quote, a general definition of rhythm. The latest, it seems, is that of Professor Sonnenschein. Rhythm is, quote, a sequence of events in time, producing in the mind that experiences it a sense of proportion among the durations of the events or groups of events which constitute the series. So be it, he adds. But on the screen, that is in cinema, the art that interests René Clair, the series of events is produced in space and in time. One has to take space into account as well, unquote. He was grappling, on some level, with the fact that cinema as a medium possesses a dimension, a creative element that music, at least in his view, does not: space. Cinema unfolds in time, and as it does so, it spatializes time. It dynamizes space. Now, for all the ways that Clair sees cinema as a distinct medium from music, he also, as you can see here, accepts a certain notion of rhythm, a musicological notion of rhythm. Rhythm is the perception of proportions, or proportional, I should say, or precisely measured durations of time periods. In other words, he accepts the idea that film rhythm, wherever one might discover it in cinema, will conform to the musicological theory that rhythm constitutes a metric pulse. Clair doesn't just accept this in theory, of course, in his writings about cinema. He accepts it in practice as well. In his early sound era film, À nous la liberté, Freedom for Us, he uses image and sound coordination to create a metric pulse in a number of scenes, like the one I'm about to show you, where the gestures of workers, first in a factory and then on lunch break, in a highly mechanized and rationalized workspace, reaching with their arms to turn a screw or to dip a spoon in a pot, carefully oscillating between movements at even intervals, all of these things line up to the tick-tock of the individual notes of the background score. Watch and listen. This is a very short sequence. I'll show you about 15 seconds of it. This is from Freedom for Us, À nous la liberté. Now, Clair does this at several points in the film, creating a kind of metric pulse of gestures and movements. Someone mentioned Charlie Chaplin and Modern Times. In fact, Clair and his production company eventually sued Chaplin for having borrowed from this film. It was unsuccessful, of course, the lawsuit. Now, filmmakers such as Clair and others from the period explored in print and in their films the possibilities of cinema as a musical form. They set their art to the rhythms of music. They viewed rhythm as a creative process which involves groupings of pulses or beats that are given a discernible tempo, the speed of the pulse. In most folk music, jazz, and other very rhythmic forms, the pulse drives the listener's experience, makes us want to tap our foot or, of course, clap our hands. Musical rhythm breaks up or distinguishes these pulses in order to create emphasis. This is accomplished through the subdivision of tones as well as through meter, the repetitive pattern of strong and weak tones. Strong notes, in the musicologist's jargon, are accented. Important notes are stressed, with weak notes and intervals inserted in between them, tick-tock, 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 of a musical cue. Furthermore, the intervals between accents are given a set periodicity. That is, for rhythm to exist, according to the musicologist, the duration between accents must be mathematically precise, consistent, and of course, predictable. But is this the only version of rhythm, the musicologist's rhythm, that we see throughout the history of cinema? For Leah Jacobs, author of Film Rhythm After Sound, which is to say after the 1930s, the answer to that question is no. Soviet filmmakers such as Sergei Eisenstein and Hollywood filmmakers such as Howard Hawks, perhaps some of you have seen His Girl Friday, for instance, attacked rhythm in various ways, musically and in strict visual terms, she argues. We can build on her account by exploring the sometimes strange notions of rhythm that circulated in France throughout much of the 20th century. A variety of French theorists and philosophers, filmmakers and film critics, in the period running roughly from 1944, the year of the liberation, to at least the mid-1980s, challenged the seemingly necessary connection between rhythm and musical metrics. Perhaps the most prominent of these is ReMission Ich, the author of the seminal Critique du Rythme in 1982, who once wrote, quite provocatively, "Rhythm is no longer, even if certain Philistines haven't realized it, the alternation of the tick-tock on the cheek of the metronomic metrician," unquote. He is, as I say, only the most prominent advocate of this position. Mission Ich's attempt to wrest the concept of rhythm from its musicological roots can be situated in a long line of French thought, which I call the mid-century rhythmic drift. During a roughly 40-year period of French thought, rhythm became associated with a variety of aesthetic, psychological, phenomenological, and even political meanings. One can trace a slow movement away from the refined usage of the musicologist. Rhythm seeped into the vernacular, the everyday language in France, as a fundamental aspect of things like human perception and understanding, aesthetic and otherwise. And this, as I will argue for you today, shaped and was in turn shaped by critical and theoretical discourses within film culture, and filmmakers participated in this. Now, to understand the rich vernacular of rhythm in mid-century France, one must avoid the temptation to impose a strict hierarchy of theoretical meanings on the concept, with all meanings flowing down from the musicologists. Post-war commentators and filmmakers in France invested new senses, new contexts into the term, and were engaged in a process described by cognitive linguists, I think of John R. Taylor in this 2002 essay, as creative category extension, in which the original function of a term, in this case musical, is challenged, and its meaning elaborated and spread out horizontally, so that the word no longer fits snugly into a single lexical category. A rich hierarchy of rhythms emerged in France, a dynamic array of sometimes loosely related, sometimes only faintly analogous meanings, spread throughout the language of film theory and film practice, with no single version acting as the center of those meanings or the peak in a hierarchy. Rhythm was what you made it. And no other French filmmaker was more aware of the aesthetic potential that rested within this rhythmic drift than Robert Bresson. As was mentioned in my recent book, which is pictured here, I show that as, why not Schill? Okay. I show that as Bresson began to establish himself as a feature filmmaker in France in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, a rich repertory of strict musical pan-aesthetic and vitalistic versions of rhythm flourished around him and created within film culture and intellectual culture more broadly a passion for films that experiment with rhythm, however that term was taken. This passion was not expressed then in the desire to see cinema simply mimic music's mathematical precision alone, its oscillating system of metrically timed notes. The rich array of rhythms presented filmmakers with new opportunities to take up that tenacious riddle, which has long been explored by French filmmakers. What is cinematic rhythm? Today I wish to take you on a journey then, to trace the diversity of rhythms circulating within this culture. Now this journey will provide us with the tools we need to return to Bresson's craft with a fresh perspective. If some of Bresson's films, as we're about to see, created stable classical experiences composed of carefully ordered durations and intervals, a kind of metric style of cinematic rhythm, other films that he made offered unstable, ruptured, and embodied experiences of rhythm, what might be called a vitalistic style. The amazingly diverse range and complexity of Bresson's temporal experiments with rhythm make his films something of a deposit of a culture's notions of time, a deposit that permits us to track the shift away even from Apollonian toward more Dionysian impulses within the French passion for rhythm. Let's take our bearings on this question by looking closely at the everyday language of filmmakers during this time. And I'm going to focus on the 50s here for the purposes of brevity. A sample of statements reveals that rhythm is viewed by a broad swath of film directors as a very basic feature of their film practice. Jean Cocteau, whose name I'm sure most of you know, the famous polymath, the revered playwright, novelist, theorist, film director, is there anything he didn't do, writes this in 1952. Editing is the cineast, the film director's, most important work. It's his style, his form of writing. It is the way images are glued one to the other that gives a film its rhythm. Jacques Blueness, an actor-director associated with surrealism, who directed several films in the 50s, offers this theoretical appraisal in 1954. Because surface and movement define three-dimensional space and duration, he's talking about cinema here, cinematic rhythm, very different from the whirring of music, consists of the photography of space-time, to which is adjoined the phonophotography of dialogue and sound. Endowed with these natural advantages, he's trying to foist up cinema here as a unique art. Cinema, more than any art, other art I should say, offers almost the perfect means to represent perceptible reality. Éric Rohmer, a name forever associated with the Nouvelle Vague, the new wave of the 1960s, offers thoughts that are more associative. Quote, just as one cannot perceive of a poet who is insensitive to rhythm, we consistently discover in all great cinematic work the presence of a certain geometric rigor, not superadded, of course, like a pointless ornament on a film, but absolutely consubstantial with the work, with the film itself. In a 1957 interview, one of the filmmakers Rohmer admired most, Robert Bresson, is asked to describe the very nature of his art. What is it that you do, Robert Bresson? To which he replies in a word, rhythms. At the same time, relations, rapport, intersections between relations, oppositions, collisions, exchanges between one image and another, between one image and all other images, and between an image and a sound, etc. Rounding out this very quick sample is a figure considered by many to be the greatest of all French directors, Jean Renoir. Some of you have perhaps seen Rules of the Game, for instance. Impatient with the temptation, with the tendency to locate rhythm, the true art of cinema, in editing, he pens a 1959 piece in which he defends the arts of acting and staging, and he declares, quote, "Rhythm is no longer produced through editing." His idea then is that rhythm ought to be looked for in acting and staging as well. So the point here is that in the post-war era, rhythm was a basic feature of the language of many filmmakers. Now, very few among these filmmakers who evoked the concept of rhythm in interviews and essays and so on explained what they actually meant by rhythm. In such statements, rhythm is many things. It remains a broad term associated with notions of personal expression via rigorous control of shot relations or editing, with a meticulous concern for the overall balance or pacing of a film, and with the suggestion of an invisible, even esoteric, quasi-geometric system at the heart of a film that only the discerning cinephile will perhaps be able to decode. So rhythm was many things. And in this, the language of filmmakers is of a piece with mid-century French thought more broadly, in the realms of poetics, psychology, aesthetics, philosophy, which set out to explore rhythm as a concept that's both more broad or broader and more fundamental than that of the musicologist's carefully timed metric pulsation of notes. If mid-century French thought eventually took up notions of rhythm that are not musical, the proliferation of rhythms in this drift, as I'm calling it, seems to have stemmed from a common attitude or posture at this time in French thought and French sensibility, an Apollonian impulse in French intellectual life. By and large, aestheticians and philosophers of rhythm focused on hidden harmonies, underlying laws, the order of things, their rigorous restraint, symmetry, and geometry. Still, there was a great deal of variation, of creative extension in the period's language. How so? A spectrum of strict musical, pan-aesthetic, and, of course, vitalistic usages of rhythm spread out during the period. Now let's take a look at a few of these usages and eventually consider how French filmmakers picked up on them. One of the most cited definitions of rhythm, and you can find it everywhere in writings in film culture and beyond, throughout the 30s, 40s, and 50s, is that of the positivist philosopher and lexicographer Émile Littré, whose dictionary, affectionately dubbed the Littré in France, restricted the term's meaning to the refined musical sense. Rhythm is the regular, perceived intervals between long and short musical tones. A towering figure in mid-century psychology, Paul Fraisse, the head of the Laboratory of Experimental Psychology and Physiology of Sensation at the prestigious École Pratique des Hautes Études, published numerous groundbreaking and widely read, it should be said, studies on the psychology of time, and the concept of rhythm through his writings was expanded into new intellectual territory, repositioned now as a fundamental aspect of biology and psychology. But this is crucial for us. The fundamental aspect of rhythm in his writing remained, for all intents and purposes, musical. In his 1956 study, Les structures rythmiques, rhythmic structures, and a work that builds on it, La psychologie du rythme, from 1974, the psychology of rhythm, Fraisse explores the analogies between rhythm in human activity, like musical composition, and what he calls biological rhythm, which he defines as an oscillating system in which individual events are produced by intervals of time perceived as equal. What are some examples? the beat of the heart, the electrical pulses of the brain, the circadian or 24-hour cycles in the movement of leaves on trees, or in the regular need to urinate. Française is a very flexible notion or approach to rhythm, one that accepts the musical definition of litre, for instance, but acknowledges an array of other usages, some of which depend on a musical analogy, an analogy with musical usages, that grants us access to the workings of human psychology. For example, when he addresses the concept of what he calls spatial rhythm, he argues that the human subject imposes a rhythm or creates it from a visual experience of space, such as looking at the Acropolis. The Acropolis has proportionality, symmetry, and most importantly, oscillating repeated elements, like columns and the gaps between them presented at even intervals. We can, Française claims, turn the visual encounter with architecture into a rhythmic experience, willing ourselves to view the columns in a pulse-like manner, with the columns as the proverbial accents here. Column, space, column, space, column, space, and so on. But this, Française argues, would be to create a virtual rhythm, not a real rhythm. Not a real rhythm that emerges from what he calls exteroceptive stimulations, cues that originate from sources that are outside the human body. The spatial rhythm we perceive in a piece of architecture is analogous with musical rhythm, but it still captures, or only analogous, I should say, with musical rhythm. But this analysis still captures, according to Française, a distinctive psychological phenomenon which he's identified, our penchant for rhythmically interpreting spatial structures that play a repetition and oscillation game. Now, if Française's research is evidence that the musical sense of rhythm was not abandoned in mid-century France, the musicologist's claim to authority on rhythm was being challenged. And as we will now see, this challenge was undertaken in analogous ways in film culture and a range of philosophical and intellectual contexts. This challenge began earlier than the post-war era, I should say, when figures like the Romanian émigré Pius Servien published this classic study in 1930, Rhythms as a Physical Introduction to Aesthetics, which explored rhythm as a concrete aspect not just of music, but of French prose and poetry. This is what I call a pan-aesthetic concept of rhythm. And it became more prominent after the liberation. It kind of exploded when more and more thinkers explored rhythm as a principle of order and symmetry behind any work of art, not just poetic or musical composition. One such thinker is Rene de Manila. Rene de Manila. Now, despite its title, his most famous book, Le Rythme Musical, Musical Rhythm, easy for me to say, in 1949, this book denies that any serious examination of rhythm's role in aesthetics can limit itself to pared down musical distinctions or musicological distinctions. He writes, "The objection that seems to stand in the way of all general definitions of rhythm that it could apply to all the arts is that it is impossible to compare the diverse aesthetic categories, that is, the different forms by which art manifests itself as fine, because there is no common measure among them, among the arts," unquote. General definitions of rhythm are difficult to come by, he says, because all of the arts are so very different. They manifest rhythm each in their own ways. For this reason, rhythm is not to be found in either temporal or spatial dimensions in art, he says. So what is rhythm for him? Where is rhythm to be located? He says, rhythm is thus neither in neither space nor time conceived as such, but in the creative genius of the artist who uses them as a frame for the symbols that find unity therein. His œuvre, the artist's work, whether it is pictorial, musical, literary, or he says even cinegraphic, even cinematic, translation of his emotion, draws from rhythm the order and proportion without which there is no work of art. In other words, rhythm is the very basis of artistic expression. What we have here is a move to establish rhythm as the essential characteristic of art itself, ordered, symmetrical, authorial expression. Now, this is surely the most common conception of rhythm in mid-century film culture. Many filmmakers echoed and even anticipated this flexible interpretation of rhythm. Filmmakers, critics, and musicians working in the industry now use rhythm in such a way that it described a widely adopted artistic or interpretive strategy. More precisely, virtually all the filmmakers that I mentioned at the top here, Jean Renoir, Robert Bresson, Jean Cocteau, as well as many cinephile critics writing for magazines such as this one here. It's a great one called Téléciné, which was widely distributed across France to the national cineclub circuit from the 40s through the 70s. They all associated rhythm with oscillating or repeated cues in time, where, and this is crucial, the periods between cues are only roughly or loosely calculated, that is, intuitive or non-metric. Now, the implication is that cinema is like the other arts in that it has rhythm, but its rhythm is different from the other arts. Along these lines, in late 1946, the film music composer Pierre Schaeffer, very important figure in the history of French sound design and commentary on sound, wrote 3 famous essays for another important cinephile journal, Revue du Cinéma, in which he proposed that filmmakers explore 4 different kinds of film-music relation. One of them is synchrony, in which the rhythms of the image and the rhythms of sound coordinate. The other is syntony, in which the rhythms of the image track and the rhythms of the soundtrack are different or distinct and work against each other. Now, indeed, one of the most widely read aestheticians of the era believed just that you could find rhythm in musical composition as well as visual arrangement in works of art. He's another Romanian emigre by the name of Matsila Gica. Like Du Mesnil, Gica believed that rhythm is a basic feature of all arts, temporal and visual. That's the thrust of his Essai sur le rythme, Essay on Rhythm, first published in 1938, and then repeatedly published throughout this period. It was a bestseller, reprinted in 1952, for instance. Gica took the pan-aesthetic position even further, however, by drawing on the philosophy of Henri Bergson, an important French philosopher, to develop what we might call our last category, vitalistic conceptions of rhythm. Now, here's a book by Christian Kerslake, in which he argues, the book is called Immanence and the Vertigo of Philosophy from 2009, in which he argues that Gica's project, in ways that anticipate the work of another French philosopher, Gilles Deleuze, was derived in some measure from the vitalistic theories of time of Bergson. Gica was a mathematician who, in numerous writings in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, theorized the spectrum of organic and non-organic rhythms we can observe in the cosmos, all of which are distinctive responses to and emergences from what Bergson called the élan vital, the vital force of life itself. Gica's work dipped into the realm of esoteric thought eventually and proposed a theory of proportionality, a geometry of spatial and temporal rhythms, in which he purported to unlock the key a single golden number, phi, as he called it, that governs all rhythms in all forms of life in the cosmos, all right? Now, if this peculiar interpretation of rhythm seems far removed from film culture, we should consider the theories of a filmmaker and theorist who was close to film practice. And his name is JeanPierre Chia. His name is here. Chartier is a largely forgotten figure, but he's pretty important. For instance, in the post-war period, he succeeded one of the greatest and most influential of French critics, André Bazin, as the director of the cultural services at the IDEC, the IDHEC, which is France's national film school at the time. In 1946, Chartier composed a 5-part essay that was published in the IDEC Bulletin, which means that young filmmakers would read this. He could have influence on young filmmakers. Now, one of the essays, the 4th in the series, was titled Cinematic Rhythm and Durational Realism. Chartier argues in that piece that rhythm in film is altogether different from rhythm in music. He says that in terms of music, the ear is sensitive to subtle constancies and changes in the length of musical tones. So our ears can intuit real durations or vibrations in duration directly from musical meter. That's what music allows us. But to argue that cinema can achieve this just by editing in a certain way, by controlling the pace of the shots and the cuts, is to use a naive musical analogy that cinema doesn't need. Chartier puts forth a theory of rhythm, then, that acknowledges that cinema depends on the durational relations between scenes of life, what we record or what the camera records, from real durations actually out there in the world that we experience. That's cinematic rhythm. Rhythm can't be in the music of a film or in the editing of a film alone. No. What he does say is this, is that rhythm consists in a movie of differentiated intensive moments. Cinematic rhythm is generated when a filmmaker chooses efficiently and effectively to move the viewer through moments when attention is no longer seized. We've all felt boredom at the movies. We've all felt our attention lapse. That's inimical to rhythm. A good piece of cinematic rhythm will keep things moving along and generate intensive moments, moments of intensive magnitude that would sustain your attention. He says that in the best films, a viewer will be engaged in a film's vibratory durations, not just because the film's action is coordinated to musical notes, but because the techniques used by the filmmaker will draw inspiration from the more organic crests and troughs in the waves of everyday experience. In film, to have truly cinematic rhythm, what we want is a film that makes us perceive, feel, and intuit the stimulating rhythms of our everyday lives, which are not musical or well-ordered or given a set metric periodicity. Now, I could go on here and continue to multiply all of these examples of rhythm in the period, but I think we have what we need by now, a sense of a culture, its language, and its thought. Before moving on to Bresson, let's take stock. What have we discovered here? That yes, on some level, French intellectualizing about rhythm reveals an Apollonian taste, if you like, for the temporal regulations of cues and of the viewer's experience, a mainly classical aesthetic of simplicity, order, and symmetry. But that's not where the story of this mid-century rhythmic drift ends. By arguing that the language of mid-century film culture participated in this creative extension of rhythm beyond musical notions, I have suggested that the more fluid notions of rhythm that circulated in the period perhaps highlight for us a point where the Apollonian in French culture began to shade into the Dionysian, where classical modernism gave way to a more mannerist one, I should say. technical control and ordered grace in the realm of editing and cinematic time were slowly being replaced by a passion for idiosyncratic panache. Rhythm was reinvented as something more intuitive for the filmmaker who now distrusted, I should say, the idea of a clockwork art and attempted to use technique to dig up the deeper roots of time-based emotion, focusing on sub-rational, embodied intensity through a less rule-governed technical ambition. All of which brings us to the experiments with rhythm, I should say, or in rhythm, of one Robert Bresson. Now, as we're going to see, Bresson was the single most important rhythmic filmmaker of the mid-20th century. Why? By virtue of his sustained effort to chart the full range of rhythmic possibilities in his art, from the musical to the poetic, to the political, from the Apollonian to the Dionysian. No other filmmaker I know of, at any rate, in France or elsewhere, was so heavily invested in rhythm. He consistently worked then to reinvent musical perception, to creatively extend the category of rhythm as a distinctly cinematic phenomenon. And did he succeed? Well, you be the judge. Now, how many of you have seen a film by Robert Bresson? Just out of curiosity, what am I up against? Okay, no one. A couple of you have seen a film by Robert Bresson. Since many of you are not familiar with him, the best place to begin to understand the privileged place that rhythm played in his work, his ideas, and creative choices, the best way to begin is this book here. All right, and I'll read the title for you because it might be too small. It's called Notes on the Cinematograph, originally published in 1975, and happily for us, recently reprinted. Notes on the Cinematograph. Now, as you read through it, don't expect it to be a manifesto that's fully developed or a systematically worked out philosophical treatise on cinema. No, this is a collection of aphorisms, of short notes about cinematic technique. In the language of the period, the ideas about rhythm he expressed here mix panesthetic with vitalistic ideas. Here's one of his aphorisms, and I'm not abbreviating it for you. This is what it looked like. Quote, rhythms, the omnipotence of rhythms. Nothing is duration but what is caught up in rhythms. Bend content to form and sense to rhythms, he writes. Now chew on that for a moment. Bresson is characteristically enigmatic and suggestive here. What do we make of this aphorism? Cinema, as he envisioned it, was like the other arts. It possessed rhythm. But its rhythm was distinctive. There's a panesthetic impulse here. To be rhythmic, to create a rhythmic perception for us as viewers, filmmakers had to write in their own way. How? In visual and oral sensations that you have in movies. That's the source of cinematic rhythm, your own sensations at the movies. These sensations were created by the filmmaker through a process of strategic fragmentation and isolation of perceptual stimuli. These are the building blocks of cinematic rhythmic composition. To achieve a cinematic sensation of rhythm in one's work, to impress upon you, the viewer, the feeling of temporal movement, Bresson recommended that filmmakers work with carefully hewn snippets of recorded sound, and on the image track with closer views. These frames are from Bresson's 1974 film Lancelot du Lac, Lancelot of the Lake, which is his adaptation, very peculiar, I should say, of the King Arthur legends, which relies on tight angles like the ones you see here, that break up the space before the camera into smaller units and truncate the actors' bodies, that give us, in short, spatiotemporal parts, not complete wholes. He was known for shooting his actors like this, where you don't see their heads or their faces. And why is that? Because when you see a face, it's an emotional cue. You read meaning onto it. He wanted to reduce that, to take away that stimulus so that all you would do is perceive just a simple sensation or impression and not read into the faces that one might otherwise see on screen. He wanted to drain his images as much as possible of semantic meaning. In panesthetic terms, Bresson was proposing that filmmakers create, in effect, their very own equivalent of the musical note. Like a note, a Bressonian image or sound carried little significance on its own. It came to us as a mere sensation or impression. Bresson's fragments not only aspired to the non-cerebral, the subcognitive, in other words, to leave direct impressions on us, but through their placement in a temporal sequence to access the durations of life, he wanted to create rhythm. Elsewhere in his notes, he writes this, quote, placed in a certain order and projected onto a screen, in other words, given rhythm, the living persons and real objects he used come to life again like flowers in water. Cinema given rhythm, if given rhythm, was a means to perceive life's rhythms anew. Now, how did he do this in his actual movies, you might be asking? This is fairly lofty language. Many filmmakers like Bresson say, I'm going to accomplish all these things, and then when you watch their movies, you think, well, wait, they don't actually achieve them. Well, Bresson's earliest experiments with rhythm in the 50s and 60s focused on one thing, the pulses of word and image. Think about what you see in most movies. Lots of scenes of dialogue. And Bresson was aware of this. So he asked himself a basic question. How do I create rhythm in such an experience? A Bressonian conversation scene was as much about the content of the words spoken as it was about how this content was bent to form, how the words become mere sensations given rhythm. One could say he's in an Apollonian mode here. In 1962, Bresson set out to adapt the original minutes of the trial of Joan of Arc into a 1-hour-long feature film. The drama would be very pared down. He would restrict himself only to the exchanges contained within the original documents that survive from the Joan of Arc trial in 1431. Now, Susan Sontag once criticized this film, writing that Bresson quoted, quote, experimented with the limits of the unexpressive. There is no acting at all, she says, unquote. The woman playing Jeanne, quote, simply reads the lines, unquote. I think Sontag was missing something here. She was failing to appreciate the film's inexpressivity in light of its original rhythmic, ambitions. What were those ambitions? Well, luckily, Bresson told us. As he said to the journal Cahiers du Cinéma at the time of the film's release, quote, every new film poses new problems. My first problem for Le Procès de Jeanne d'Arc was that of a film consisting entirely of questions and answers. I gave them rhythm. That was his solution. The uniqueness of this film is that the rhythm of speech drove the rhythm of the images. To feel this film, therefore, to take in its art, one must look not to expressive acting, but allow the relay of speech and cutting to just intuitively impress upon us. In a scene that takes place 5 minutes into the film, Jeanne makes her appearance before the tribunal. The image track, as you're about to see, relies on a simple shot-reverse shot editing schema. As we cut from Jeanne to her interrogator, Bishop Cochon. Cochon is pressuring Jeanne to swear, in other words, to repeat her pledge to tell the truth, which she had already done in the film. Watch and listen. Feel the rhythm. Whoops, it shouldn't be skippy like that. I'm sorry how it's filtering through the system.
Is Et si vous me demandiez de vous dire quelque chose que j'ai juré de ne pas dire, je serais par juge, ce que vous ne devriez pas vouloir.
Vous devez dire la vérité à votre juge.
Prenez garde, vous qui vous dites mon juge, vous assumez une grande charge.
Nous requérons de prêter serment.
Faut-il jurer 2 fois en justice?
Voulez-vous jurer simplement et absolument?
Vous pouvez bien vous en passer.
Nous vous requérons de jurer de dire la vérité.
Je dirai la vérité, mais je ne dirai pas tout.
Okay, do you see, already feel it? You're being brought up here or whipped up into a certain tension between them that Bresson would say comes not from the expressivity on the actors' faces, but from rhythm or the use of rhythm here. Now this is just 26 seconds of a 3-minute long scene. The entire scene has an average of, get this folks, 3.6 words per second. Bresson allows line delivery, the delivery of the actors, to dictate the pace of the cutting or the exchange of camera angles. Shots are permitted just 1 sentence or question, a 1 line per shot tempo. The shots I showed you follow a beat one could almost tap one's foot to. Here's how we might notate the rhythms at work here. In shot 14, one of the shots you saw, which lasts 2 seconds, Jean asks, "Must I swear twice before the court?" A line delivered at a rate of 3.5 words per second. We cut to shot 15, a 2-second shot, I should say, in which Cochon replies, will you swear simply or absolutely, delivered at a 3 words per second pace. Cut to 16, a 1-second shot of Jeanne stating, "You don't need it. Vous pouvez bien vous en passer," which increases to an astonishing 6 words per second. Finally, we cut to shot 17, which is held for 3 seconds. Cochon, "We require you to swear to tell the truth," delivered at a 3 words per second rate. Later in the sequence, the drama intensifies. And how do we know it? Rhythm. In other words, the actor playing Cochon, as this drama intensifies, begins to speak at a rate of almost 7 words per second, almost double the average of the sequence itself. What am I saying? The speaking rate, the brevity of the lines or questions, and the coordination of the cutting with the line delivery create a kind of rhythmic pulsation as Jeanne defiantly questions the intimidation she's experiencing here. The sequence is not unexpressive, as Sontag alleges, but its expressivity is to be perceived indirectly through the rhythmic relay of male and female voice. 5 years later, in the wonderful, heart-wrenching film Machete, highly recommended for those of you who have access to filmstruck.com, all right, which contains the Criterion collection, filmstruck.com, you can get access to this film. In this film, Bresson's Apollonian rhythms emerge not through speech, but through the impact of bodies, a rhythm that is relatively hot, at least for a Bresson film, that is expressive and even erotically charged. The title character, a young girl living in destitution, beset by a life of trauma, of abuse, ridicule, and an ailing mother, finds only one true moment of pleasure in this entire 1.5-hour film. By dint of a gift from an anonymous woman, Mouchette is able to ride the bumper cars at the town carnival. She spins about, elatedly colliding and eventually beginning to flirt with a young man. The collisions let out, listen for them, a metallic crash or thud. We hear it again and again, a dozen times or so. A pattern of relatively even intervals soon controls the temporal structure of thumping bumper cars, the sounds of the bumps of the cars, which I'm going to ask you to listen for. Now, this is how I'd have you visualize this. This is bumps 4 through 9. You'll hear what I mean by this in just a moment. Look at the carefully timed rhythmic intervals here between sound cues, between the bumps of the cars. 5 bumps are represented here. They appear about a minute into the sequence I'm about to show you. And they show that Bresson carefully, almost imperceptibly, pairs off the sounds of the cars smacking one another, with Mouchette in one and in many cases, the young boy she's flirting with in the other car. A relatively long interval, lasting roughly 6 seconds, will be followed by coupled sounds. Bump, bump. As the sequence progresses, these coupled sound cues begin to impress upon us and start to express the budding flirtations between Machete and the young man. Take a look. This is a famous sequence in the history of Bresson's cinema, often commented upon. Here we go. Bump, 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 bump. All right, so he's creating this experience, not saying that we are necessarily cued to attend to the timing here, but he does order the experience. The rhythms of Machete, while to a certain extent embodied through the body, through the crashes or impacts of body, remain fairly, I would say, Apollonian in their dependence on a system of metrically timed beats eventually, and the principle of oscillation between long and short intervals. Bresson organizes these bodies into, and the spaces between them, into a preconceived kind of abstract structure, paired beats. Well, in a sequence from The Devil Probably, this is my last example here before I wrap up, made 10 years after Machete, Bresson takes on the problem of temporalities and rhythms of the body, where order is not sustained, where the vibrations of experience intensify to the point of creating unpredictable beats, disordered or disorderly eruptions, and repetition patterns so dense that they overwhelm the viewer's ability to really assimilate them or feel them consistently. With The Devil Probably, Le Diable Probablement, Bresson turns toward the Dionysian or mannerist rhythm suggested in vitalistic theories, which I mentioned, toward a rhythm that moves closer to the eccentricities of our everyday lives. The principles of musical composition that have governed his editing rhythms until now, repetition, oscillation, metrics, are placed at the service of new durational forms derived from lived experience. Localized forms of musical or semi-musical order are made to serve a governing impression of vitalistic disorder. Now, Bresson wrote the film's original script as a personal form of direct commentary. It's one of the few times he ever did this, on the feeling of disillusionment and aimlessness among young people in the post-May 68 moment. In May 68, as many of you know, waves upon waves of French student and worker protests sought through sit-ins, occupations, marches, and violent uprisings to challenge the very capitalist base of French society, to expand workers' rights and eventually overthrow the regime of President Charles de Gaulle. Le Diable Probablement follows the string of at times futile encounters and conversations of the disillusioned 68ard, Charles, pictured here on the right with his friend Michel on the left. In search of purpose, really, Charles attends an anarchist rally. He debates environmental politics with friends, joins with hippies singing on the banks of the Seine in Paris, and has his problems diagnosed by a psychoanalyst. None of this works. The film's commentary on the seeming futility of the post-May 68 moment and its radical causes comes through not all those scenes, though. His encounters with the psychoanalyst, his encounters with, let's say, debating environmental politics. No, the futility of the moment comes through in this film, and it shouldn't surprise you, in its rhythms. Especially during the scene of public transportation where passengers contemplate the hidden forces that govern their lives. Editing on some level seems to impose a unity on the sequence. By cutting back to this shot here, the protagonist Charles and his friend Michel as they're seated on the bus. The young intellectuals strike up a political conversation at the beginning of the sequence. A conversation that workers around them eventually join. However, we don't remain with the conversation. We oscillate to surrounding rituals of public transit, and these oscillations from the protagonist feel, to a certain extent, disruptive. The camera simply abandons the two protagonists from time to time. The viewing experience becomes, therefore, distracted, and here and there tempts kind of shapelessness from a temporal experience perspective. The intervals that draw attention away from the conversation erupt suddenly and form variable clusters of at times somewhat abstract visual and acoustic stimuli. Here is the point before I get to a clip here. These stimuli draw us into the fragmentary impressions that constitute the flow of everyday experience aboard this bus in the post-May 68 moment. Instead of experiencing rhythm through a thin thread of familiar recurring elements that create a beat, the viewer is given a dense weave of forms, sometimes alienating in their digressive, abstract quality, diverting us from the protagonist's conversation and overwhelming it in the process. The bus sequence implicates us in a swirl of impressionistic rhythms, leaving us with an unclassical sequence, really, that tests our ability to discern its rhythmic center. We search for the beat, but we don't quite find it. Try to keep pace here. And then I'll conclude.
Ce qui est magnifique, c'est que pour rassurer les gens, il suffit de nier l'évidence.
Quelle évidence? On est en plein surnaturel, rien n'est visible.
C'est incroyable.
Les gouvernements ont la vue courte.
N'accusez pas les gouvernements. Dans le monde entier, à l'heure actuelle, personne, aucun gouvernement ne peut se vanter de gouverner. Ce sont les masses qui régissent les événements. Des forces obscures dont il est parfaitement impossible de connaître les lois.
C'est vrai que quelque chose nous pousse contre ce que nous sommes.
Il faut marcher, marcher.
On marche avec celui qui obspecte toujours. Qu'est-ce donc qui s'amuse à tourner en dérision de l'humanité?
Oui, qui nous manœuvre? Le diable, probablement.
you have to ask yourself, I mean, we've seen a lot of movies, all of us. Why shoot a conversation scene this way? It's very peculiar. Because he wanted, to a certain extent, to capture the life rhythms of the post-May 68 moment, the vitalistic rhythms. The rhythms of the sequence are multiform. They're often disruptive and conflicted. They evoke one form, I would argue, of alienation experienced in the post-May 68 moment, and specifically by the working class. This unharmonious medley of rhythms captures several rituals of mass transit as they interrupt, a political exchange. A stop is requested. Workers come, passengers move. Their marching feet tap the floor. And like well-trained citizens, they validate their tickets in an orderly manner. Click, click. But other motifs rupture these orderly patterns somewhat. Recurring complex compositions using reflective surfaces structure our experience too. They elicit our attention, which is now divided. When the conversation resumes between Charles and Michel, other passengers now chime in, raising hopes of perhaps a proletarian awakening, but the exchange lacks intimate fluidity. Some voices are disembodied, and those speakers who are pictured occupy seats that are turned away from each other, so that fellow passengers remain faceless. We cut away to other distracting rhythms, patterns of movement in the surrounding traffic. The driver, whose point of view seems to be suggested in the mirror shots, is perhaps at this stage picking up bits of the conversation. But the conversation does not build to a harmonious crescendo. Participants are not shown turning toward each other, standing, and gathering in a show of conviction and solidarity. No. Staging and editing keep the passengers separate, their voices isolated. Modern life and its vitalistic rituals, its unruly rhythms, insulate and ritualize the workers' activities, even outside the workplace. A bus is paradoxically a space where the proletariat gathers, and a space where the rhythms of bodily experience prove to be inimical to efforts to organize politically. The political exchange is cut short by protocols, again rituals, and by the rhythms of the driver's own workplace. His attention, like ours, becomes split, and the bus crashes. His other workers in their cars outside the bus, of course you heard it and chuckled at it, don't greet the driver with a demonstration of solidarity, but rather with an impatient chorus of horn blast, given a discernible beat. They make music with their horns. But these same circumstances undermine all efforts in this case to speak as a single voice in political life. The disorderly, unpredictable rhythms of modernity, in this case of mass transit, secure the perpetuation of the status quo, thwart the potential for revolution from below. Bresson, in his own way, then, extends the category of rhythm, reinventing musical perception, transforming it into a means for critiquing what he viewed to be the destructive repetition patterns of modern capitalism and of workers' experiences. And with that, I end. Thank you so much. By all means, I'm now at your service. Yes?
I was thinking, I sort of think of rhythms as sort of feeding into the tendency of humans to be pattern seekers. That we look for patterns, and patterns allow us to anticipate, predict, and art basically plays with that. It can play into it, or it can kind of disrupt it by breaking patterns and making things unpredictable. But it has to do with this sort of pattern recognition.
I think that's absolutely right. I think the way I teach my undergraduate students is I say this. Filmmakers are folk psychologists. They have an intuitive understanding through their practice of what works and does not work on viewers, on audiences. But filmmakers know intuitively that we are pattern-seeking mammals. And so they play with that. Think about the basic plot of a movie. There are patterns. Characters come back. We see an object, for instance, like the snow globe in Citizen Kane. And we anticipate that if it's going to be important, it will return. Pattern seeking, no question about it. What I'm saying with Bresson here is he takes that to almost an extreme and tries to prime you through his statements, through his interviews, through his writings, to see him as playing with a certain kind of pattern formation, right? And I think it's a very challenging thing to keep up with what he's doing, especially when he gets to, I love the way you phrased it, to this movie here, The Devil Probably, where he sets up patterns to break them and hopes that you pick up intuitively on that breaking and that it becomes unsettled because we are pattern seeking, if you like.
Your reference to folk psychology makes me think that there's a certain tension in what you were describing. So it's the natural question for me is what are the units, the relations among which determine rhythm in the case of film? And I think the natural answer that occurs to us first is their events, or event sequences, or their actions that make up events. Of course, there are actions that make up actions, and so on. So a big issue in the psychology of film perception is how do we segment events as a way of having rhythmic flow. But that's all very narrative. That makes rhythm depend upon narrative. And yet a lot of the devices you referred to seem to dispense with narrative and emphasize rather manipulating the focus of attention, let's say, of the audience. So the unit then becomes the colors, the shapes, the sounds, and whatnot to which you're attending. I'm wondering how those two things fit together. Maybe the point of it is that this isn't a great accomplishment to blend them in a certain way and complicate matters.
Well, great. I mean, one had a limited time here, and if I could expand, I would have argued this. Bresson played at rhythm in narrative and in these more what I call localized rhythmic flourishes. It's almost as if he set out in his movies to give himself the opportunity to do certain scenes like this. Not all of his scenes are like this, or like the bumper car sequence, for instance. He'll have these isolated 1 to 2 minutes where he'll really set himself a creative challenge rhythmically. That's just on individual sequences. But what I also argue in the longer version of this is that he structures and orders, if you really look at it, your perception of the narrative. He's got one movie which is difficult to see because it's tied up in rights called Une Femme Douce, A Gentle Creature from 1969. And the rhythms there at the narrative or macro level involve shifting between past, present, past, present, past, present. He does this with very short scenes that last maybe a minute, 30 seconds. And the movie is structured that way all the way through, this oscillation between two time frames. Within that, of course, he'll have certain scenes that he plays with these flourishes. Another one of his movies, which you can see on Filmstruck again, is called Au hasard Balthazar, By Chance Balthazar, which is the best movie you'll ever see that has a donkey as the protagonist. Okay? You can imagine that he loves donkeys because they're so inexpressive. He doesn't have to coach a donkey to be inexpressive. They are, right? Now, what he does is he wrote this original script as a series of embedded or nested narrative structures where we expect recurrences in time. Certain kinds of characters will return, for instance, setting up a kind of anticipation of rituals of returning. Certain characters will meet the donkey. Later, they'll meet the donkey again. We then anticipate they'll meet the donkey for a third time and a fourth time. So he works at the narrative or macro level, but also in these more localized structures of editing here and sound design.
To what extent do you think rhythm is a psychological phenomenon, different for individual perceivers
To what extent is rhythm a psychological phenomenon different for individual
So
perceivers?
the things that you showed us might have been perceived in 20 different ways, but I mean, there's certain control that the filmmaker is exercising, but how much control do you think he has in that regard?
So how much control does?
Do you think the filmmaker has in that?
Okay. Filmmakers will plant cues, and then they send, like any work artist, they'll send their work off into the ether and hope that some of their ambitions reach a viewership. What I tried to argue here, I'm a cultural historian of film and media. So what I do, have any of you ever heard of the art historian Michael Baxendale? No? He was a student of E.H. Gombrich, if you've ever heard of him, who wrote The Story of Art. In any case, Michael Baxendale, he wrote a book in 1972 called Painting and Experience in Renaissance Italy, or 15th century Italy, Painting and Experience in 15th century Italy, in which he tried to dig up what he called, and the word is now spread, the period eye. Okay? He tried to look at, and he wasn't speculating, concrete documents and evidence for the sensibility at the moment. How did people see in the marketplace? And he came up with some documents and evidence that people saw shapes they would gauge. So if they went and bought like a bag of grain, they would be able to judge based on shape of the bag how much is in it and its weight. What Baxendale does is walk through the layers of cultural history and argues that painters picked up on this vernacular skill of gauging and were playing with it in their art. Now, what I'm saying here is this is what cultural historians perhaps can add to the question of the psychology of rhythmic perception. We can dig up those moments, those cultures, where rhythm seemed to be a vastly discussed thing, where you could picture viewers being inculcated in this by reading a great deal about cinematic rhythm. I could have emphasized it here more. Journals that circulated to cineclubs in France, so crucial at the time. One I listed for you is Téléciné. Now, what's a cineclub? They roared back in the 50s and 60s in France. They were exclusive clubs that would have groupings of this size. We would come every Saturday night. You'd have to have an exclusive card that would be punched. And you wouldn't know what movie you're going to see. Imagine that. It would be an adventure. But you would go to these screenings, not only to see and view films, but in order to talk, to converse, and to listen to speakers. Now, that journal that I mentioned to you, Téléciné, was circulated to hundreds of thousands of these cineclubs around the length and breadth of France. So people were being viewers. You'd have essays in that on Bresson's Machete that would be 10 pages long, that would have a section on the rhythms of Machete, coaxing you, inculcating in you, training you how to watch this thing. And then afterwards, you can imagine, you would have a speaker, someone like me, who would get up, and we would talk about what we've just seen. And sometimes in France, these conversations would go on to 1, 2 a.m. People would stick around for lengthy, hours-long discussions about these things. So to get back to, this is a long-winded response to your question, to get back to it, what I'm interested in looking at is not necessarily whether individual viewers, in that psychological sense, individual audience members pick up on these things from moment to moment. I mean, all of us, some of us have perhaps seen only a few French films, and if you were to watch this the first time, you wouldn't pick up on these things. That's fine. And that's the way cinema works. It impresses upon you in your own ways. But what I'm suggesting here is when you have certain cultures that are kind of interested in looking in certain ways, interested looking, that's what we have. That's another kind of psychology, which I would call not the study of audiences, individual members like yourselves, but study of viewership. Were there certain viewerships that were created in periods that don't refer to individual viewers, but refer to how we can reconstruct tendencies from the available historical documents, from the available movies, was there a way that the movies were playing to viewers, even if individual audience members did not pick up on it? All right, so viewership versus audience members, if you like.
Well, before we think our speaker and like filmmakers with their films send you off out into the ether, I can't help but mention, since you talked about the JeanPierre song, that you could walk across campus and go to what we call Cafe Bergson, which was donated by relatives of Andre Bergson. So you can go and pretend to be in the French cafe and have a nice conversation, enjoy some coffee and so on.
Do you ever do those movie nights on campus where they would show a film and...
Periodically, we do. We're working in film and media studies to create more of a sustained series, and in due course you'll all hear about it.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you to Colin Burnett.
Thanks to all of you.